and welcome to Season 3 of the ReFolKUs podcast, where we talk to artists and music industry workers about building sustainable, creative careers with a focus on folk. I'm your host, Rosalind Dennett. Hello and welcome to ReFolKUs. Our guest today is Terry O'Brien. Terry is the founder and director of Sound Roots, which runs the annual national showcase English Folk Expo and Manchester Folk Festival, as well as supporting the English folk scene year-round. Terry has also run Playpen Agency for over 20 years, representing a host of award-winning artists, including Grace Petrie, Spiers Boden, Daoirí Farrell, and more. Please welcome Terry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
It's so lovely to get to chat with you. And where are you calling in from?
I'm in, I'd like to say sunny Norfolk, but it's not so sunny today, in the east of England.
We really appreciate taking time out of what's probably your evening right now to chat with us. So today we're interested in exploring the UK music market and specifically looking at it from a Canadian lens. So maybe we could start off, if you could give us a bit of an overview of the folk scene in the UK and maybe a little bit about how you got started working in it.
Sure. How I started working in it was I took on an amazing artist called Jim Murray a long time ago. And he was a really groundbreaking folk artist over here. And as a result of taking him on, I had to learn everything that I could learn. And he was a great teacher, actually. So, yes, the folk scene over here is quite sort of interestingly structured. There are sort of layers to it. I mean, I guess most, emerging artists are coming in at folk club level and they're playing the folk clubs first. And then once they develop, they can move into the art centres and the theatres, hopefully. And obviously there is a really wide range of festivals that run throughout the year, obviously primarily in the summer, but throughout the year. And nobody actually knows how many of them there are. I think that there's currently, nobody has taken a survey, but I think the last time they looked some years ago, there was about 300 of them. So there's a lot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's an impressive amount. Can you maybe describe a little bit about these festivals? Is there like a certain quality about the folk festivals in the UK that maybe sets them apart from ones in other countries?
Having been to festivals in Europe and a few in Canada, they're not fundamentally that different. I think the Canadian festivals are much bigger. I think we have a lot of festivals that, obviously we've got Glastonbury, which is just crazy size. But on the whole, our folk festivals are smaller because we're talking about smaller populations and such a great mix of festivals that people have got an awful lot of choice about where they go. But they are still, like the Canadian festivals, very family-oriented, more than the rock and pop festivals, which are more for sort of young people, teenagers and 20-year-olds. But they do get a range of ages. Perhaps there are some festivals like the classical and the jazz festivals that maybe have an older age range. Festivals really are beautifully diverse in that way. And they tend to provide quite a lot of family activities as a result.
That's wonderful. And when you were talking about folk clubs, what's the folk club scene like? Are there dedicated venues? Certainly in Canada, we have less and less venues that are dedicated to folk music and more like folk societies that will inhabit various locations. So what does that conjure for you when you're talking about folk clubs?
Yeah, I think the folk club scene grew out of the folk revival in the 1960s. And actually, a lot of the people who started those folk clubs then are still running them now. So you've got very much a sort of an aging population of promoters in the folk club scene. And they are generally using the back room of pubs or community halls. They're not owners of property, even where there are sort of the odd folk society, but there tends not to be so much of that here. It is more about enthusiastic volunteers mainly running these things in whatever room they can find available. And some of them, have had to change venues over the years because venues are sold and they move on. So, yeah, it tends to be that structure that was set up in the 1960s that is still kind of running very much in the same format of, they'll have local artists performing at the beginning or between the headline artists. They'll have occasional folk clubs where there's no guest artist, there's just only the local artists, and then the guest artists will appear maybe once a month, or there are some clubs where they have a guest artist every single time. Some run weekly, some run monthly, some only run quarterly. So it's a lot of variety. But we have found that a lot of the folk clubs are starting to close inevitably because the promoters are retiring and there are not a lot of young people coming in to take over those folk clubs. There are a few that have been handed over to other people, but a lot of them have also been closed, particularly COVID inevitably. Hit that scene quite hard. We're seeing some young people sort of reinventing the idea of a folk club in a different format altogether, which is really exciting. But we need a lot more of those to keep the whole scene going at that level.
And when you're talking about that kind of reinvention, what does that look like? How are people doing things in some new surprising ways for you?
I think that, there was a little bit of a formula that was used in the folk clubs right through this sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, which involved floor spots, possibly a raffle at half time. You'd raffle off the CD and everybody get involved. It's very sort of stuck in its way in some ways, but it's obviously been a really successful formula. There are young people coming in doing things quite differently now. The Magpie's Nest crew that came in the probably early 2000s that really brought in, no raffles, no floor spots. Everybody was booked, but they were really trying to book very diverse, different kind of formats of music and bringing in things like choirs and collaborations and things that maybe the average folk club wouldn't do. And there are some young musicians who are touring musicians who are also running their own folk clubs that are taking their sort of new generation approach to it while still giving a stage to folk artists, which is great.
That's very exciting. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the more landmark festivals or clubs and such that people could look up.
In terms of clubs, I suppose the ones that, maybe best known over here are places like Nettlebed that have been running for decades. In fact, they've all been running for decades. So Hitchin Folk Club is a really well-known one. Most towns will have their own folk club somewhere. It may be under a slightly different name from the town name, but it will be there. And there are actually lists online that you can go and find that will give you sort of contact details and so on.
Oh, great. So you work with Manchester Folk Festival. Can you tell us a little bit about that festival and how that operates?
Yeah, well, English Folk Expo, we operate under the umbrella of Sound Roots now, which has been quite a recent development. But originally, we were just English Folk Expo. We were just doing one annual event every year, although it did take the whole year to organise it. So originally, we were English Folk Expo. But as a showcase event for industry, we needed to have a sort of public festival alongside it to put a public audience in front of a lot of the showcasing artists so that the delegates could see the showcasing artists in a real situation where in front of a ticket buying audience. So one of the first things that we did was work with the Met in Bury to set up a new festival of English folk music, which we called Homegrown. And that ran alongside English Folk Expo. So same weekend. And the majority of the showcases were in the public festival and delegates would come in the back of the room and see the artists. When we sort of outgrew Bury in Greater Manchester, we moved into central Manchester and reinvented that festival as Manchester Folk Festival. So we actually run both events because they kind of need each other to work.
And does that take place then in clubs or is it outdoors? What does the festival look like?
It's a city festival, so Manchester's quite big. So we work in one quarter of Manchester, which is called the Northern Quarter, and we base ourselves in the really legendary venue in Manchester called Band on the Wall, and then use venues within 5 or 10 minutes walk of Band on the Wall. So we probably use 8 or 9 venues around that area.
That's amazing. And the way that English Folk Expo works, and maybe you can kind of give us a little bit of insider info there, but typically it's mostly UK artists, is that correct? And then there's some featured acts that are international?
Well, English Folk Expo started originally because we wanted to provide a platform for English folk artists who really weren't getting a platform anywhere else. And the original inspiration for English Folk Expo actually came from a long-lived showcase event in Scotland, which had been really successfully showcasing Scottish artists for years, called Showcase Scotland. And we kind of looked at that model and thought, why isn't there something like that in England? Because English artists also need a place to showcase in front of the industry. So our event is primarily about English folk artists showcasing to industry. However, we do have a partnership program, which means that we can bring really interesting, exciting artists from around the world to also play on our stages during the event. And at the moment, the model that we've developed is to have 4 partners each year. So last year was our first year with 4 partners, whereas previously we had just one dedicated international partner each year. Last year we had South Korea, Prince Edward Island, Flanders and Sweden, all bringing artists to our event and showcasing. And it is something our delegates really love. It's always the most exciting part for them, and everybody wants to know who the international partners will be before they come.
That's wonderful, and such a neat way to spotlight folks. And let's say if a Canadian artist were to attend English Folk Expo, is there much interaction between the artists? Like, is there a chance for collaboration or for meetings? Are there B2Bs or anything like that go on?
We've always been really focused on live performance and networking. So we've not had a conference program. We don't do panels or debates or anything, because I've been to a lot of those, and quite often you sit in the debate waiting till the end so as you can network with everybody who's in the room. So we just thought, well, okay, we'll just let everybody network. And we've sort of created ways to structure the networking to make it as easy as possible for people who maybe don't know anybody to get to know everybody. So that's the focus, is the networking and the live performance. The live performance program is pre-programmed. It's an application process for artists that closes probably 9 months before the event. The applications close, and then we announce artists over the following months. So it's not possible for an artist to just turn up and be part of the program. That's not an option. But we do have sessions. We have a session in the pub next to Band on the Wall. We have a lovely session run every night by an artist that we bring in to sort of facilitate it. But anybody can join in the session and play along. And obviously there's plenty of opportunity to mix and mingle with the artists, who we encourage to be around as much as possible over the weekend. Last year, we partnered with an organisation called Unconvention, which does a conference program for artists and brings in industry experts over 2 days to provide content and information that's useful primarily to artists and plays to an artist audience. So all the artists that we have showcasing, they get the opportunity to go to Unconvention as part of the weekend. And obviously any other artist who is there can also sign up for Unconvention and take advantage of the fact. And those are daytime events. They do cross over with a lot of the networking and live performance showcases in English Folk Expo, but it creates some options for artists who are there.
Great. And for an international artist or Canadian artist that wants to break into the market, maybe book a gig or start building their audience in the UK, what would be your recommendations of places to start?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I think that you can't really get anywhere without relationships. It's very, very hard to book a tour from across the Atlantic without knowing anybody who's here. So, I mean, I would say that if you have the resources and, you want to invest in your career and that's an option for you, then coming over and attending the showcase events that happen in the UK and meeting people and making contacts is the first port of call. You can't really achieve anything without knowing people. So, you need to build up that network of contacts. And if you turn up with, CDs or a USB or whatever in your pocket, or a download code, or and information about what you do, and you're talking to people and not being impolite about it, but obviously providing information when people ask what you do, then one thing can lead to another, and you can certainly follow up with all of those contacts when you're back home and start to develop those relationships. And even if somebody can't necessarily suddenly do something for you right now, it's amazing how in months and years down the line, those contacts will turn out to be really useful, even if it's just to pick up the phone to them and go, I don't understand this thing about the English market, can you help me? So, I mean, obviously it takes quite a lot of resources to come across here to go to these events, but I really would recommend it if it's an option for you. And there are sort of key ones. Obviously, English Folk Expo, I would recommend to everybody because it's the best. But there's also Showcase Scotland, there's Focus Wales, there's Americana Music Association, if your music is on that side of the sort of folk spectrum. I think Showcase Scotland don't think that you can register there as a delegate because it's quite sort of closed and because of the expense of running that. I think that Focus Wales, I believe that you can attend as a delegate as an artist. English Folk Expo does allow it, and I know Americana Music Association Conference does allow it. There's also WOMEX in October, which will be held in Manchester in England, and is a conference for, over 2,000 delegates. So there's an awful lot of networking that could be done at that, and that's in October this year.
In the scenario where you're an independent artist looking to, let's say you have some relationships already built and you're looking to, continue to grow, do you find that you need an agent, or can artists kind of DIY booking in the UK? Or is it typically handled by agents and promoters?
Well, I am actually an agent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's something that I've been doing since before we started English Folk Expo, and I'm still doing now. So as an agent, my artists have developed international careers at the point where, we're starting to get requests from Australia for an artist, and we're starting to think that maybe that's a territory we should develop. Then we probably won't have an agent over there for the artist. So as their agent, I will try and book a tour for them in Australia just to get things off the ground in the hope that an agent, comes on board later. And I can tell you, it's not easy if you don't have the relationships, if you don't know the venues, you don't know the festivals, and it all, even if you do the research, the only email address on the website is an info at address that you're not sure where that goes and to whom. It can be very hard work trying to get through all of the noise and get to the person who is programming, and then without any relationship with that person, get them to listen to the music and potentially take the risk on an artist that they haven't seen live. So it is very difficult. I have done it as an agent. I've booked tours in Canada and Australia without the support of a local agent, but it is hard, so obviously you can do it. It's not impossible. And if you've got relationships and people that you can drop an email to and go, can you tell me the best venue for folk music in Cheltenham or wherever it is that you want to get your next gig, then that really helps. But things get so much easier if you can find an agent to work with the artist, because those agents have the relationships, that I have venues that will take virtually every artist that I give them because they trust me and they know that most of the artists that I send their way, they will sell out the venue or nearly sell out the venue. And therefore they really trust me. And when I go to them with something new, they'll probably take it, even though they've never seen that artist before. So, if you can get an agent on board who has those sort of relationships, obviously things are going to be much smoother.
So, now in this scenario, I've now made up. So let's say we've got a tour now. We've got a little tour booked throughout the UK. How do you suggest promoting that tour? I'm sure there's like PR people. Do you recommend going that kind of route? And how are people discovering music and finding out about live events?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that, if you're talking about a first tour over here, don't do it without an album release. Because if you're releasing an album to match up with a tour, you've suddenly got more outlets. You can't really go to radio with a tour. They can't play that on the radio. But if you can go to them with the latest single off your new album that's going to be released in 2 weeks' time, they can play that and talk about your tour. So suddenly you've got an outlet that will help promote your album and your tour. So try and sort of plan ahead and think that definitely your first tour over here should be an album tour. your album should probably come out maybe 6 to 4 weeks before your tour, so that there's time for people to discover the music, get used to it, enjoy it, tell their friends about it, all the time that tickets are on sale. And yes, you need PR. And I've worked with Canadian artists over here, and the first thing I said to them was, right, you need an album tour and you need PR. And I'm not going to book this tour unless there's PR, because, people need to find out about the artist, especially as they're new on the ground. It's going to need somebody championing it with media, telling them that this is an artist they should pay attention to, and perhaps go and check out and see. So I'd say that with an album release, you need national PR. So you need somebody to take this album to the national papers, and if you're lucky, they'll also do national radio. Some PRs do radio as well. Sometimes you have to hire a separate plugger to do radio. But you should also consider potentially using local PR, because local PR will work the local newspapers and local media outlets around your tour dates. It's an additional cost, but local PR tends to be quite a bit cheaper than national PR, and it's very targeted around your shows, but it can really make the difference. And obviously, if possible, and if you have the resources, some advertising money is really important. Facebook advertising is probably the best way to spend your money. It's less expensive than print advertising, and it can be very much targeted to the audiences. But print advertising can be really useful because it also gets to the promoters. It gets to the festival organisers, and, the people who run the venues are very likely to read specialist media and specialist print media. So,
Yeah. What would be some print publications that you would recommend?
well, there's less and less of them each year that goes by because it's very hard to make money in print media. But probably the key ones would be Songlines, which is more sort of world music but does cover folk music a lot, and R&R magazine, which used to be called Rock and Reel, which covers all genres but is quite strong on folk music. But yeah, there are not a lot. And then obviously you need to hit all the national papers and their music reviewers.
That's great. And you mentioned ads on Facebook. This is kind of a weird question, but is there much of like a folk scene in the social media space, do you find, in the UK, in terms of like using TikTok or Facebook, Instagram, any of those?
There are a few, Folk and Honey, I think it's called, and Viral Earth, folking.com, are all ones that have sort of, some of them are more chat based, some of them will do some listings if you take the time to put the listings up there, and you definitely should hit those as much as possible. For what used to be called Folk Radio UK over here, who's just changed its name to Cloth, which is capital KLOF. I think one of the reasons they changed the name is because they're doing such a broad definition of folk music and might not, it takes in a lot of things that other people might not consider folk. So, but at its core, it is still a folk music outlet. And there are opportunities to advertise on what was Folk Radio Cloth. That you can buy banner ads that are relatively affordable if you've got a little bit of advertising income. If you can provide posters and flyers to the venues, that's a really good idea. It is obviously another expense, but you're controlling your brand if you can provide it to them, and they really will use it. If you have some strongly worded emails about don't ask for a print that you're not going to use, but even though it's quite a traditional way of getting information out there, it's still quite powerful, and you can tell that because the venues really care about whether you give them print or not. So check what sizes they need, make sure you provide the right sizes to them. But you'll occasionally find that venues have huge poster sites, and if you can provide that AO poster that they need, they'll put you on the street, to advertise your gigs. So
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice, because you're tapping into the audience that's already aware of the community and the venue that you're playing. So that's a great bit of advice. So I'm wondering, for Canadian artists coming in to do a tour, is there any support in place for folks And I'm speaking from personal experience because I once did a tour of the UK and was appointed the driver. And it's one of the few times in my life I've really prayed for my life and everybody else's. It was terrifying. You're driving on the opposite side of the road. It's a very different experience if you're not used to it. Are there like tour managers or folks that musicians can access or hire to help with the driving when they're touring UK?
There are definitely people who do that. There are less than there were because we lost a lot of crew during COVID who moved on into other industries and never came back. So lighting, sound crew, but tour managers as well that kind of moved out of the industry. So they're in really short supply and can be quite hard to find because they're all freelancers. So it's really about kind of word of mouth finding these people. But they are out there. I mean, in the ideal, financially, you really want a driver who's also a sound engineer, don't you?
Yeah.
In the ideal. And, that used to be the norm. But, for small tours, that certainly was the norm. But yeah, I mean, driving on the wrong side of the road, the roads are a lot smaller here. They're very windy. They're not long, straight roads like they are in Canada. And it can be a terrifying experience. So if you're not a confident driver, I would advise dropping a line to some of the English folk acts or the UK folk acts over here. I'm sure they would be very happy to just point you in the direction of a tour manager if they know one. Without knowing you, just say you're an artist coming over and you're just looking for some advice, and I'm sure they'll be able to help.
For international artists, well, actually specifically Canadian, because there might be different rules for Canadians. Do you know about the visa process, or is there a visa process for folks who want to come over and do some gigs in the UK?
My understanding is that Canadian musicians don't need visas to come over here. What they need is a certificate of sponsorship. And there are various organisations that are licensed to be able to provide certificates of sponsorship. So you need to get hold of a certificate of sponsorship licensor, and they will do the paperwork for you for a fee. The actual certificate of sponsorship, which is obviously issued by the government, costs £25, but there is administration that needs to go with that needs to be done for you, and the people who are licensed to do this will charge various amounts of money, but you will need that in order to get into the country, and it will require you to have it as you come across the border, and you will need to make sure that you get a stamp in your passport. So you need to go through the gates that are not automatic. You'll have to go and get a physical stamp in your passport as you come in, as part of the clearance to get through as a working musician coming into the country. You will also need to apply for a waiver for tax, unless you want to be taxed fully on all your earnings, because the venues are required to hold back, I believe it's 20% of your earnings if you're a foreign national. But you can apply to have that reduced or taken away altogether by declaring your expenses, and that if you're not making any profit or making a low level of profit and it's beneath a threshold, they will waive the tax altogether, but provide you with a certificate if you are charged withholding tax that you can then put in with your end of year tax return so that you're not taxed twice.
Oh, that's great. Is there like through like the musicians union, or is there someone that folks can contact in order to like get those forms or get hooked up with the people that do the sponsorship?
I think a search for certificates of sponsorship in England will get you what you need. The MU obviously will provide services to their members. So unless the Canadian artist is a member of the English or UK MU, then the help that you'll be able to get is limited, although there will be a lot of information on their website that could be useful. But obviously the MU are mainly UK members, so that's not something, they don't need to have certificates of sponsorship. So that information probably will be on that particular website.
And then have you seen effect on the UK folk scene now post Brexit, like since Brexit's gone through? And what's that been like?
Not good. Not good. And I don't think anybody in the arts ticked the box for Brexit. I'm still pretty angry about that one. So yeah, it's really not a positive development at all. Certainly not for musicians. It's mainly the impact is on UK musicians trying to get into Europe. because obviously we're not as welcome as we were.
Mm.
So I don't think it's something that Canadian or North American artists need to worry about too much. It's not really impacting on them. The only impact that maybe they would see is that, combined with the war in Ukraine, which has caused a cost of living crisis, and the various activities of the Conservative Party over here, mean that people's income has really been taken a hit. COVID plus Ukraine plus some really bad mistakes by the Conservative Party mean that people don't have the kind of money that they did have pre-COVID. So we are all seeing an impact on ticket sales over here. And unfortunately, it's most acute with new artists. It's less acute with artists who were already established, had their audience. That for those artists, there's really much less impact. But at the lower end of the market, smaller venues, new artists, that's where it's particularly felt that people just don't have the money to spend on tickets that they used to have.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to be because there seems like there's still the appetite for big major spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to see, legacy artists, and less so folks willing to take a risk on something new. So I certainly applaud folks that are, especially I feel like especially in the festival circuit where, you kind of already have that community built in and can take some risks on, introducing some new artists in. It's pretty vital that we keep those channels open for people to enter in.
I think people are doing what they can. I mean, the festival scene over here, on top of all those things, plus Brexit, has also been impacted with everything. And they are finding that ticket sales are really slow. They're late. They're not sure whether those ticket sales will ever come in. But if they are going to come in, they'll come in late. And that's making cash flow really difficult. And we're finding that a lot of the festivals have closed or are closing or, are cancelling or diverting to next year. So it's really impacting there. I was at a meeting of the Association of Independent Festivals over here a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that one of their reactions to the situation that they find themselves in because of the late ticket sales and festivals dropping off the map all over the place is that a lot of them are reducing their stages. So there's less stages, and the stages that they have, they're doing less slots. But on a positive note, because of the costs that they're facing and the fact that festivals are saying that their basic costs are going up by 30 to 50% compared to pre-COVID times, they're also wanting to spend less money on big headline acts and are turning to emerging artists to fill some of those slots. So on a positive note, I think there are some moves to move towards emerging artists. And I think that also what I've been working in music for 20 years now, and it is definitely true that if you hang around long enough, things will rebalance. There are always dramas going on in the music industry. There are always problems with live touring and all the rest of it, but they are relatively short term. The system will rebalance itself and opportunities will re-emerge. So, it may be quite difficult this year, last year. Maybe next year it should be a little bit easier. And I think as time goes on, it will rebalance itself and those opportunities will come back. And with a little bit of creative thinking and not sort of relying on things always being the same, artists can create opportunities for themselves.
You've mentioned some differing opinions or differing kind of definitions of folk and what folk is. And certainly the UK has its own kind of like trad music and traditional folk music. Do you have your own personal philosophy? Has that changed, or what conjures in your mind or heart when you think of folk music?
Or if you're talking about what is the definition of folk music, that's like asking for an argument.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, to be honest, as somebody who's been in folk music this long, I've learned not to ask that question. I mean, it's almost like there is no answer to this because literally everybody has their own idea of where the boundaries of folk lie. But I mean, certainly with English Folk Expo and Manchester Folk Festival, we take the broadest possible definition, right from trad to acoustic pop music, because pretty much everything is folk music, isn't it? If you really take it down to the wire, it's influenced in some way by folk music or can be traced back to that. So I think that the trick is not to get too hung up on the definition.
I love that. Certainly, I like to think of it like, if you think you're folk, you're folk. Ta-da!
Exactly. And then, if it's useful to you and it feels right, you can also be an Americana artist, and that can give you other routes into opportunities. And you might just sit on the side of jazz as well. And maybe there are jazz outlets. And, I think that sort of not defining yourself too tightly can have some good results. But obviously there are a lot of folk festivals, there are a lot of folk clubs. If you feel that you sit comfortably there, then there are opportunities there for you. But, once you go into art centres and theatres, how you define yourself isn't so important, because those are general spaces for, general arts. So, it's up to you and your audience how you get defined.
Yeah, certainly it's like a genre means nothing, but also could be exactly like you said. I like that, like using it as a tool essentially to access communities or certain markets that might want to know more about you and could be a good fit. So where can people find out more about what you do with Playpen and then more about English Folk Expo?
Well, there's all the usual websites that you can go to that's got lots and lots of information. And English Folk Expo is actually also very soon launching a new website called Sound Roots Connect, which is directed at artists primarily, to give them information and education about how to break as an artist, how, all the different areas of the music industry that they need to know about, with some interviews with real key players in the industry over here on hour-long videos that really go into depth over things, and also sort of give information about new opportunities for funding and for performance opportunities. So this is going to be launching soon. So watch out for Sound Roots Connect. But if you sign up on the EnglishFolkExpo.com website for the mailer, then you'll get the news on that. But I think that would probably be really useful to artists abroad coming into the UK, because it gives a real UK spin on things, although there is some information about international stuff on there as well.
Oh, fantastic. And Terry, it's been such a pleasure to get to chat with you today. Thanks so much.
Oh, you too. Thank you for asking me.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is brought to you by Folk Music Ontario. Find out more by heading to folkmusicontario.org/refocus. That's ReFolkus. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalind Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is by King Cardiac and the artwork is by Jamie Card. Please give us a download, a like, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you're listening. Until next time, keep it folk and have fun.